WBUR Podcasts, Boston.
I'm Daryl C. Murphy, and you're listening to The Common. Mandy McLaren. Hello.
Hi.
How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. So you're an education reporter for the Boston Globe. You're on the Great Divide team, which looks into educational inequality in Boston and around the state. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's us.
Okay, great. I want to set the table for folks because you've got a story for us today about a civil rights organization that claims it is being barred from monitoring how Boston Public Schools spends money to support English language learners, despite a decades-old federal court order that gives them the permission to do so. Before we dive in further, tell us who this group is and how they came to be involved with the Boston Public Schools.
Yeah, the group is called Multicultural Education Training and Advocacy, Inc., or META for short. And they will tell you that they were Meta before Mark Zuckerberg.
I was just thinking that's
Meta.
kind of unfortunate.
Yeah. But anyways, so META is, like you said, a national civil rights organization, actually based in Massachusetts, but that does work across the country, particularly advocating for low-income students and students that are either immigrants or refugees themselves, or children of immigrants and refugees that are English is not their first language. And back in the 90s, essentially, the civil rights group heard from the community that English language learners were not being served by Boston Public Schools. And if I'm remembering correctly at the time, BPS only employed something like 7 English as a second language teachers. And that was just not enough.
For the whole district?
Yeah. And that was just not enough to keep up with the growing student population there. And so this led to a federal lawsuit that wound up in a district court. And the judge on the case sided with META and agreed that BPS wasn't doing enough for this population. And what's come out of that case is this 1994 amended order that gives META the right to essentially be the watchdog over BPS's spending of federal Title I dollars for English language learners.
Mandy, you mentioned Title I dollars. What is that?
Great question. It is the largest federal, essentially, entitlement program, but for education. And these dollars are supposed to be directed to schools with large populations of disadvantaged kids. And these dollars are supposed to supplement, not supplant, local funding, which means for English learners, you're not supposed to use this money to pay for an English learner teacher. That's federally required, right? Like that's bare minimum. So this money is supposed to go above and beyond. Some ways that BPS schools have paid for or have used the funds in the past, for example, might be buying an extra curriculum, particularly to support English learners, or to pay teachers stipends for tutoring English learners after school.
Okay, I understand. Got it. What's at the heart of this conflict between META and BPS as it stands right now? Can you tell us about that?
So according to META, BPS is essentially icing META out from its responsibilities under this court order. And there are 2 things that the court order prescribes that BPS has to do. BPS has to let META in when they're developing the budget for this program called Title I. And so when the district is planning how to spend these federal dollars, META has the obligation to essentially be looking over BPS's shoulder and making sure that they're spending them appropriately for English learners. And the second part of this court order is what I like to think of as like, okay, now show me the receipts. So BPS has to, at the end of a school year, give META these documents called checklists that show for, each school, for example, here's how you said you'd spend these dollars on English learners. Here's how you actually spent them, how much is left over. And from there, the idea is that Meta can see, one, if BPS is spending the money appropriately, and two, think about maybe there's a better way for when we loop forward in the cycle to the next budget, maybe there's a better way for us to be spending this money.
At this point, I just want to clarify, we are talking court orders and all that type of language and stuff, which can be complicated, right? But at the end of the day, what this is about is, it just raises the question about whether or not English language learners in the Boston public school system are getting the attention, funds, and resources they need to thrive.
That's correct. And it's not a paltry share of the district's population. At this point, English learners account for nearly a third of all of the students in the Boston public schools. So there's about 14,500 of them. And they speak, I think, more than 70 different native languages. And so it is a main responsibility of the district right now when a third of your kids fall into this category to, court order or not, right, ensure that you are providing them the services that they're legally entitled to.
What have you heard from BPS in response to Meta's allegation?
Yes, BPS has told me that it disputes what Meta is saying and that it has complied and it's continuing to comply with this court order from the 90s. It's something that Superintendent Mary Skipper at a budget hearing last week after our story ran reiterated. She said that the district's practices are consistent with how they've been operating with Meta in the past and that in due time, Meta will get access that it is entitled to.
We are going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back.
Did you kill Marlene Johnson?
I think you're one of the first people to have actually asked.
From WBUR and ZSP Media, this is Beyond All Repair, a new podcast about an unsolved murder that will leave you questioning everything.
Somebody should be in jail for murdering my sister.
A woman who's never been believed.
As long as they think I have done this, then they're not looking for who actually did this.
And that's what makes it a cold case.
No, it's a botched case.
And a search for the truth, once and for all.
Wow, it just gets more interesting.
Beyond All Repair. Listen and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
Be careful. You're digging in a place that's been very peaceful for a while.
Do it anyway. Dig.
And we're back. Let's back up a little bit. Meta has the right to monitor BPS under a federal court order, as we've established. What does that really mean? I mean, what does that look like in practice? Take us into the weeds a little bit.
Yeah, so I think it's important to address like this pot of money, right? I believe for the upcoming school year, BPS is projected to receive $45 million in Title I funds from the feds. And so what BPS needs to be doing is spending a share of that pot of money in proportion to the share of English learners in the district. So English learners make up 30% of the district's population. Therefore, BPS needs to be spending 30% of its Title I funding on English learners. And what that would work out to be for the upcoming school year, I believe, is about $13.5 million. So when we get into the Meta said this, BPS said this, the thing at the center is a lot of money, $13.5 million, and 14,500 students, and whether or not those dollars are going to those kids.
How do you reconcile BPS's response with Meta's claim?
I'm still working on reconciling the two. I think it's clear that there is a conflict here. There is a dispute. I don't know if the two sides are arguing with different facts or if there's a misunderstanding between the two. But what has been told to me from each side doesn't necessarily match up, right? Meta is saying we haven't been given the access. BPS is saying we're complying, which implies that they are giving the access. So yeah, working on reconciling those two, I think, is our job moving forward to keep asking those questions. One thing that I did have in the story that the Globe ran last week was looking at the share of funding that the district spent last school year and sort of combed out all of the line items that were explicit for English learners and added them all up. And the total I got there only accounted for about 14% of the Title I budget, right? And we're trying to hit that 30% threshold. So I sent a question to BPS about that for them to help me understand, am I missing something here? I have not received a response to that question as of recording. That is, again, things that still need answers moving forward. I believe, based on comments that the BPS CFO made at a budget hearing after our story ran, is that what they will say is, oh, well, what you were looking at is just how schools are spending the money. We're also spending a bunch of money on ELs at the district level. And so you might not see that delineated in the budget, but it's there.
Setting this conflict aside, do we have any other reasons to think that BPS might need a little monitoring when it comes to how it supports its students who are English language learners?
Absolutely, we do. And that is one thing that advocates that have seen this reporting on the Meta dispute have pointed to as why we should be taking this seriously and getting to the bottom of it. So one thing to note is last year, BPS narrowly avoided this takeover by the state, right? The Department of Elementary and Secondary Education did this big audit and found a bunch of problems. And one of those things was how the district is supporting English learners. Hundreds of these kids either were receiving really poor instruction or weren't receiving any specialized instruction at all. As part of the district's essentially deal to escape the takeover, that's a big problem that they need to rectify. But that's not all. BPS is also under this 2012 settlement agreement with the federal Departments of Justice and Education due to, again, failure to adequately serve these kids. So there's a number of metrics that BPS needs to report to the feds on, such as what percent of our ESL students are actually receiving ESL instruction. And so according to BPS, they are hitting their growth, their goal targets for those metrics, and they're on the up and up with the DOJ for that. But it just starts to feel like, okay, there's just one thing after another. And it's for this population where the parents may not necessarily be able to advocate for their kids in this system that defaults to speaking English, right? Like that's how things are set up. And so that's where you have groups like Meta or other advocates that come in and say, this is really important that we have eyes on this.
Okay, Mandy, there's a lot going on here.
A lot.
What are you watching for going forward?
Well, one thing that's ongoing right now is the overall BPS budget process. So the school committee is slated to vote on it this month, and that's about $1.4 billion. And so wrapped up into that is this Title I funding. Now, Meta is saying we should have a say in that before the budget vote. It sounds like where BPS is coming from right now is saying, no, you'll have a say this summer when we get into the nitty-gritty details of how we're going to spend those dollars. What I'm looking for moving forward, one is getting that call from Meta and with them saying, hey, today's the day we heard from BPS. We know when we're going to be able to consult on the budget process. And those receipts that they owed us from last school year, they finally got around and gave them to us. So still waiting on that follow through from last school year. And then I think just due diligence as a reporter to keep an eye in general on Title I spending. It is targeted for these schools that are really struggling and have kids and families who haven't been given a lot of privileges in their lives. And I think there's an onus on education reporters to be that watchdog as well, to make sure that that money is being spent in the right way.
Mandy, thank you for taking us through this. There's a lot going on, so we really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for having me. A pleasure to be here.
That's Boston Globe reporter for The Great Divide, Mandy McLaren. And that's our show for today. Thank you so much for listening to The Common. Make sure you hit us up on Instagram, Twitter, or TikTok at WBUR The Common. You can also send us an email at thecommon@wbur.org. I'm Darrell C. Murphy, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.